Good afternoon. We are here for our monthly Mile Lunch and Learn. Today we have Dr. Ortiz. He is an assistant professor in hearing and speech sciences at the University of Maryland, College Park, where he serves as the director of the Language Diversity Lab and the certificate in bilingual speech language pathology. His research centers on the identification of language related disorders in bilingual children, with an emphasis on the disproportionality in special education, equitable access to educational services, non biased assessment, and increasingly, the use of technology enhanced approaches to assessment and intervention, including automatic speech recognition and natural language processing. So today, Dr. Ortiz will be chatting with us about building shared expertise for multilingual learners, strategies for long-term growth. Thanks for coming today.
All right, wonderful. Thank you. Can I take it away?
Yes, take it away.
Great. All right, so why don't I share my screen here? Okay. Okay, can we see the presentation there?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. So what I will, oops, sorry. We have to go back to the beginning here. Hang on one second. Sorry, a little hiccup. Okay, let's try that again. Okay. Okay. Let's start from the top. All right, thank you. Thank you for having me. And what I'm going to be talking about today is some work that I have been doing that focuses on mainly on assessment. That's kind of my area of focus in my research and as a practitioner as well. But I'm going to try to draw connections between the work that I have done as a speech language pathologist and the work that my colleagues in education do as well. Um, I am a speech language pathologist. I'm an assistant professor here in hearing and speech sciences at the University of Maryland, and I direct our certificate in bilingual speech language pathology. Um, and a lot of the work that I do is really focused on assessment. I'll go through, kind of how I see the work that I do in the bigger picture in education. Um, and how we can take some of those lessons that we have learned and apply them to supporting the outcomes for the kids that we work with, and the kids that I work with are mainly bilingual kids. So here are our learning objectives for today. So we're going to identify some of the challenges of bilingual assessment, look at trends in special education related to disproportionality for multilingual learners, and we're going to look at what we can do to address some of these challenges. So we'll start with some background information section, some background information here, and then we'll talk about some of our core principles of assessment, talk about what we can do to address some of the challenges that we see, and then we'll wrap up. So just for a little background here, the terminology around kids who speak multiple language is diverse. There are a lot of different ways to describe these kids. I mainly use the term bilingual, and I will explain why I use the term bilingual, but you also see multilingual. We've heard emergent bilingual, English learner is used to describe certain kids. We've heard English proficient bilingual. We've heard dual language learner. There's a range of different terms. So the reasons that we might use one term or the other might be related to the specific population, like emergent bilingual versus English proficient bilingual, if we're focusing in on English language acquisition or English learner. I'm going to use the word bilingual to describe the kids that I work with because I think it's the most accurate representation of the experience that the children that I work with most closely who are Spanish English speakers uh, to kind of describe the relationship between Spanish being a minority language and English being the prestige language. When we use multilingual, we intend to talk about any range of different languages, but I think bilingual more accurately characterizes the specific experiences of children who are from language minority communities in the context of a larger prestige language. I'll also mention language-related disorders and specifically referring to specific learning disability and speech language impairment, developmental language disorder, language impairment. These are high incidence disability categories, so I will refer back to these. Before we jump in, just a few questions that I frequently hear, and I hope that we will get enough context from what we learn in talking about disproportionality and assessment to be able to kind of come to some solutions. I'm not going to answer these questions directly. Rather, I pose them to you because they've been posed to me. If I don't speak a child's home language, how do I know if their language development is on track? What do I do if I'm concerned about a communication disorder? Is it better to refer for a disability evaluation or wait? Let's see if we can kind of work through some of the knowledge that we'll gain and see if we can come to conclusions about each of these things. But just kind of think about these questions. You might have had these questions and how they might apply to your work and based on the information that we learned here, what you might do. So a few different facts about our multilingual learners. About 10% of kids in schools are emergent bilinguals. So when we say emergent bilinguals, I'm referring to English learners, kids who go into school without previous English experience. A really interesting fact is about 20% of the US population under 18 is exposed to a language other than English at home. So this was from the most recent American Community Survey from the US Census, that a very large proportion, a fifth of US households speak languages other than English, or a fifth of children in US households speak languages other than English at home or are exposed to these languages. So we have a very substantial proportion of our country, of our child population, that hears languages other than English at home. We also know that there are academic difficulties, and we see disproportionality in special education for our bilingual children in the form of underrepresentation and overrepresentation. And I'm going to talk briefly about this so we can understand, have a shared understanding of what we're talking about. Overrepresentation, let's say group A is our monolingual kids and group B is our bilingual kids. Overrepresentation exists when we have a greater likelihood of being represented in special education for group B versus group A. So we always have to have a reference group. And then underrepresentation would be the opposite. I've made up these numbers. These aren't actual numbers, but I'm just demonstrating to you what these might look like. But we can actually see what the numbers do look like. So this is from a study that was published last year that uses the early childhood longitudinal study, kindergarten class of 2011. And what we're looking at here are the rates of receiving special education services for emergent bilinguals and English proficient bilinguals relative to monolinguals. So we have communication disorders and specific learning disability. Communication disorders being a very broad category, obviously, but this will include things like developmental language disorder, phonological delays and disorders. This is your kind of catch-all speech language impairment that you'll see on IEPs. And what we see is that there is, for our emergent bilinguals, for both communication disorders and specific learning disability, a disproportionate growth in the likelihood of receiving special education starting around third grade. We also see that for communication disorders, there is underrepresentation in kindergarten. That means for both bilingual groups, emergent bilinguals and English proficient bilinguals, we we are probably not getting identified with disabilities in early childhood to the same degree as monolinguals. It looks like we have it's 2%, so that's 2% of the total population versus 4%. We have half the likelihood of entering school with a diagnosis of some communication disorder. Why do these problems persist? Well, there's a lot of different reasons, and that's a little bit beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. I would like to think more solution oriented today, but a lot of the challenges that we see We have to think about the long term, what happens before kids enter school. So we know that children who are from low resource communities might have not have the same level of access to early childhood education and healthcare services. And by the time they enter kindergarten, um, that they might not have those diagnoses to get the support they need. And there might be a wait and see approach. And then this kind of grows into overrepresentation because now we're a little bit later at providing the services. So we can think of something like this, where, um, on our flow of actions that's happening for our bilingual kids. And remember, both emergent bilinguals and English proficient bilinguals enter school with lower rates of identified communication disorders. It's a this really perpetual challenge that we face. It's a persistent issue that really hasn't gone away in a lot of places. It's not universal, but this pattern where we have children entering school with lower rates of identified disabilities, uh, then we don't have the tools to be able to identify the disabilities well. There might be a tendency to kind of wait and see, and we do know that that's a common, though not universal trend where there might be a feeling that it's better to wait to refer a child who doesn't have previous English experience for a special education referral rather than jumping the gun to avoid misdiagnosing them. But ultimately, what we're doing is we are restricting access to services because we're not sure, because I don't speak their language, so I'm not sure what to do. So I'm going to wait. It might be bilingualism that, is the cause for what I think are areas of concern. So I'm not going to do anything. And then by the time the child needs services, we're at third grade. So that's a problem, right? We also know that there's some research out there that suggests that teachers might be hesitant to refer kids for special education evaluations if they're currently receiving ESL services. So this wait and see approach is kind of not great. It doesn't really accomplish what we want it to. So with that in mind, let's focus a little bit on how that connects to assessment. And I want to make sure that I'm very clear about this. There are a lot of narratives around what we think is the core problem. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that there's no simple explanation as this, if we solve this thing, this will solve the issue. I'm going to talk about assessment because it's the area that I know best, and I know that when we do a better job at assessment, at the very least, what we can do is make sure that what we're doing is accurate, that we have precise tools, and that we're administering them in the right way. But we have to acknowledge that fixing assessment won't fix everything. Um, and when I say that, what I mean is fixing the tools themselves, getting more tools, getting better tools is going to help a lot, right? But we also need to be concerned about when we're using these tools and how we're using these tools. And even if I have fantastic tools, it doesn't really do me any good if we are not administering them when we should. So one thing that we need to consider, let's talk a little bit about assessment quality first, and then we'll talk about the timing, and then we can jump into an overview of some things that we know about working with bilingual kids that we can then apply to what we do when we're working in practice in education settings. First of all, we know that many testing methods that currently exist are not great for evaluating bilingual children's language. And what I mean by this is not, we have wonderful tests like the BESA, the Bilingual English Spanish Assessment, which is normed for bilingual kids, developed specifically for the purpose of evaluating bilingual children's language. I'm not talking about tests like that. I'm talking about when we have tests like an English standardized language assessment that we then apply to bilingual children. And there have been some cases in which there have been standardized tests that were intended for bilingual children that, at the end of the day, don't really do a very good job at identifying communication disorders. So, this is a concerning thing. There are very few tests that are going to do what you need to do when you're working with bilingual kids. There are a lot more Spanish English bilingual tests out there than other languages, but at least for what we have available in the United States. But there are many more monolingual English standardized language assessments than anything else. So one thing that we need to be concerned about is when certain groups of kids perform systematically differently than other groups of kids. Like if bilingual kids generally performs worse on X standardized tests, we know that that is not good. And we often refer to that as bias. So I won't get too deep into the weeds on different types of bias, but I just want to sketch them out here for you briefly. We talk about content bias, linguistic bias, situational bias. Um, I just want to make sure that I ground us in concrete definitions about these things because a lot of times I think we use these concepts without really considering what they mean. Again, when we talk about bias in assessment, we're talking about systematic differences in performance, and that could be related to the content of the test itself, meaning that there's something about the pictures on the tests that is making kids perform in a certain way. It could be there's something about the structure of the test. Linguistic bias, meaning that there's something about the language of the test that is causing kids to perform in certain ways. So, for example, if you have a test that is intended for monolingual English speakers and it's written only in English, but then bilingual kids aren't going to perform as well. We also see the same for speakers of non-mainstream dialects of English. Situational bias is frequently an issue that we come across, and this happens when kids just aren't familiar with the circumstances, with the context of performing in a standardized testing environment. And I've seen this a ton of times when you're working with a very young child, like a 3 or 4 year old, and they have never experienced a standardized test before, they might not perform as well. And these are things that we need to take into consideration. Um, I think it's important just to understand why some of these things occur. Standardized tests are really interesting tools. Fundamentally, they're based on a principle that if we take a population of kids, adults, whomever, and we administer the test to them, we're going to get a distribution of performance, and then we can compare the performance of other kids to this distribution that we've collected. But if you have somebody that's outside of that group, they're not included in the sample that was used to norm the test, then we might not get an accurate representation of their ability from that test. So, that's an important thing to consider when we are trying to select our methods of assessment. Um, for our bilingual kids, we have another element, another dimension that we take to consider, which I don't know if we often consider this as much as we should. To some degree, for kids who are receiving support in ESL classes, we do have a sense that they're changing over the time. Their language is going to be continuing to develop. Their English will continue to improve. One thing that we also see is that their home language, their L1, might start to not improve at the same rate. So frequently, what we see is that we like this idea of additive bilingualism, whereas we're adding more English that we continue to strengthen both languages. In reality, what happens is we frequently see a pattern of subtractive bilingualism for kids in the US, where the language dominance kind of shifts from L1 to L2, and we have this English focus. And because we have that, the focus on the L1 becomes a little bit less, and we have a stronger English ability as our L1 ability goes down over time. So that's something that we need to consider. It's hard to fix that, as a thing that exists. It's a very common pattern. But it is something that we need to consider if we are evaluating children's language. I think in a lot of instances we see, oh, child speaks X language, they speak Spanish, they speak English, so I'm going to do the evaluation in that language without considering how these things are changeable and how there might be different levels of language ability across the two languages and how they, might shift from the fall to the spring. The other thing that I mentioned, so assessment quality is a really important concept that we have to consider. We also have to consider timing. we could have the absolute best assessments in the world. We can have the world-class, perfect, very precise assessment tools. But if we don't administer them when we need to, they're not really going to do much good. And there are a lot of different reasons why we might not get the timing totally right. If you can imagine the extremely constrained resources, high case loads, large classrooms, lots of kids that need evaluations, it's very easy to say, listen, I'm not totally sure if there is a concern about language ability. So the best thing that I can do is be conservative and just wait and see, because I'm going to wait until they learn a little more English, and then I can make that, call in a little bit. I don't want to, make a rash decision. Unfortunately, we know that's not a great approach, but it can feel like there's not really a solution to that. But this is clearly a problem. The timing of when we're administering our assessments is going to make a really big difference in making sure that we catch kids who might need support. So a question becomes, what is the solution to this? And as I alluded to, there is no one solution. There's no one thing that will give us the fix that we need that will make everything better. Um, and I really, admittedly, this is an area that I have thought about a lot, but I struggle to come to a really concrete, well-defined model or approach that will universally, solve all of these issues. What are the all of the things that we can do together that will really, if we were doing these things, that will really make a meaningful difference. So, rather than kind of try to propose, here is the manualized solution to these problems, I'm going to go through all these things, because really, we're talking about complex issues that are related to not just what happens at school, but what happens before kids come into school. I'm just going to go through a few different core principles of bilingual, not just assessment, about bilingualism and how we work with kids, drawing from my experience in speech language pathology as a practitioner and as a researcher to see if we can better understand how we can apply these things to the work that we do. So I'll go through several core principles here, and then I'm going to try to connect them to what happens in the real world. So the first core principle, and this is something that might sound extremely obvious, and you might have heard it before. It might, just sound like, okay, no, I've heard this before, saying it again and again and again. Assessment in both languages is best practice. This is something that we hold it's a highly valued concept in speech language pathology. It's very important that if we are going to conduct assessment on a child who speaks two languages or three languages, we want to make sure that we measure all of those languages. Um, it might not be possible all the time, but if we can, that's what we should do. And the reason that we should do that is, one, we know things like distributed vocabulary knowledge exists. So this is a very common concept where if I'm a young bilingual child and I speak Spanish and English, I might have some words represented in one language and some in the other. And that's a very, very common pattern. It's not unusual at all. As we get older, we'll have words in both languages, but it's common to have distributed meaning that it's distributed across the languages, distributed vocabulary knowledge. When we do assessment in both languages, we can also make comparisons across the languages. So we can look at, well, they had, their mean length of utterance looked like this in this language and this in this language, and we can kind of make comparisons. That also allows for a better look at developmental grammar. So we can look at morphemes, different aspects of grammar that are present in one language but might not be present in the other. And the reason why you would want to do that is because if there is a concern about language development and you look at only one language, you're never going to be totally sure that what you're seeing is not related to an English language acquisition issue. If you can look at the other language, you can get a much better idea of, oh, okay, they acquired this thing. So that means I know that they can. Maybe this is not a communication disorder, or maybe it is, but I need to look at the other language to be able to do that. So How does this apply to the work that we do when we're actually working with kids in schools and clinical settings? So the first thing that we need to consider, we think of assessment as this one-time snapshot thing. And in a lot of ways, or in a lot of instances, that's the way it happens. I would argue that there are other ways that we can use this principle of assessing both languages, like using this for progress monitoring. So, for example, if I'm working with a child, I made it a routine part of my job. If I was going to measure somebody's progress in therapy and I knew that they're bilingual, and if I speak both languages, I will do my best to make sure that I'm monitoring their development in both languages. So I can continue to measure how things move forward in both languages. In this similar vein, when we're doing screening, frequently, if kids are coming into school, if we're doing language screening, we might do that in English only. We should consider using both languages for screening if possible. As I mentioned before, language dominance is a moving target. So this makes it a little bit difficult to be able to kind of pinpoint where somebody is without thinking about where they might be in the future, because this will change over time. But if we can continue to measure in both languages, we can see how these things shift over time. One thing that is important to acknowledge, I say that cross-linguistic assessment is really good, assessment in both languages is really important. A lot of times it's not possible, right? So what do we do then, right? So this is not one of those, well, if I can't do assessment in both languages, then I shouldn't do anything at all. I'm just not sure what to do. That is absolutely not true. If you go in to working with anybody, knowing, okay, I know that assessment in both languages is the best thing. That is best practice. I know that's going to give you the most representative characterization of somebody's language ability. If I am not able to do that, what can I do? Well, maybe there are other ways that I can get that information. Just knowing that will kind of push me into figuring out, okay, maybe I can work with parents to see if I can identify some of these things. Maybe I can, if there is an interpreter available, I can do that. Maybe I can learn a little bit about their home language to see if I can figure out what I'm seeing might be related to that. There's a lot that we can do if we do our homework that doesn't necessarily mean going out and doing a direct assessment of both languages. If you know that there might be elements that you are missing by not examining that other language, there you can find a lot of different ways to get a little more information in that area. Some examples of what we do in speech language pathology for considering both languages might be language sample elicitation in both languages. There's this really interesting concept of vocabulary assessment using conceptual scoring, where we'll do something like we'll administer a vocabulary test, and then any of the items that somebody got wrong, then we can re-administer them in the other language. And then we have tests like the BESA, which is specifically intended for administration in both languages. Okay, so second core principle here is supporting the L1. Again, this is probably something that you've heard before. And if you have done this before as an educator, the speech language pathologist, you already have a well-developed sense of how to do this, then, this might not be any novel information for you. But I think it's important to reinforce some of the basic points here and maybe think about new ways that this kind of applies. So why would we want to support the L1 and not just support the L2? Because we have a lot of us might have heard this refrain that, you know what, the child has a communication disorder, let's focus on English to make sure that we're maximizing the support there, which is wrong, and I will explain why in a moment. We know that when we support the home language, there is going to be more progress than we would get if we focus on English only. And I mean supporting the home language, not in isolation, but let's include that with the work that we're doing in English only. Even if I don't speak that language, there are different things that we can do to get there. We know that when we do that, many of those skills will transfer to the language that we're working on. So, for example, in speech pathology, I might be working on a specific sound, right? And if that sound is shared across languages, that sound will then, if I can make progress there, it will benefit both languages, and that's wonderful. We know that kids use their language differently. They might speak a different language at home with friends, family, at school. Their language use is going to differ across environments. And what we're seeing in a lot of instances is just one environment. The school environment, unless we're doing work at home or in other places, we're only getting that kind of one-dimensional perspective on kids' language ability. So, what we really want to do is maximize impact by supporting their language in a range of different environments. And again, that doesn't mean you have to speak the L1, but we can support it in different ways. And this will ultimately lead to more opportunities to continue to develop these skills at home. So, a few different ways that this might kind of, these are just a couple of different examples, but we can think of more measuring language ability through multiple sources. So again, I mentioned this before. If we aren't able to do direct measurement of the home language because we don't speak that language, we can use other means of getting that information through parent report, teacher observation. If we do have interpreters, that's going to help us to get a sense of what's happening in a child's L1. We also know that there are lots of different things that kids might say in their home language, in their L1, that they might not have in their second language. If we can use some of those strengths and integrate them into our instruction and intervention, that might be beneficial. We also want to make sure that when we're selecting treatment targets, as we talk about in speech pathology, that we're identifying the things that are going to be overlapping that will have the maximum benefit across different languages. So that might mean that I'm focusing on concepts that I know, okay, I'm going to focus on this. I know what context it's used in. This is a home environment type of concept. And I'm going to focus on that. And I'm going to try to make sure that I do this in a way that I know the child will learn something from so they can apply it to their home language context. So I want to go off on a little tangent for a minute, um, just to make sure that I don't miss an opportunity to dispel a really pervasive myth that frequently comes up. This question comes up a lot when a child has a communication disorder and they're exposed to two languages. Is this going to be a problematic thing? Um, and the answer is a resounding no. And we have a lot of evidence to support the fact that for bilingual children with communication disorders, even severe communication disorders, or severe disabilities that have a severe impact on their communication, that the result of being bilingual is not a negative at all. The outcomes are the same, whether we have monolingual children or bilingual children. The idea that we need to restrict input to English only in order to make progress is antiquated and not aligned with the overwhelming evidence that we have from numerous studies over the years. So what we want to make sure that we're doing is, first of all, administering intervention and providing instruction in a way that is evidence-based. And to do that, we know that the best thing that we can do is to support children's home language. So, as a really, really simple way to start, a really easy thing to do. You might think, well, I don't speak the home language, so I'm not sure how to support it. Very easy way to start. Let's stop telling people to stop speaking their home language at home with the kids. Right? That is a very easy way. If you're already doing that, fantastic, but a lot of people aren't. So th this is a really, really important thing. And this is a fantastic starting point. Beyond that, there are a number of other things that we can do, and you can get very creative about how you approach these things. But supporting the L1 starts with an acknowledgement that continuing to use the home language will help overall communication. So for the children that we work with communication disorders and bilinguals in general, we can make a lot of gains if we just support language development and don't get too hung up on the specific language that we're working on. So for a lot of the bilingual kids that we work with, As I mentioned, we see things like distributed vocabulary knowledge, which is going to be a really important thing to consider for the young kids. We also know that there are other aspects of bilingualism, like code switching, code mixing, that come up a lot. These are all very typical characteristics of bilingual kids. And what our goal should be is to consider how we can make the most progress by continuing to do the things that we know are evidence-based. Just a very quick side note, code mixing can be a really interesting way of engaging with kids and isn't going to be detrimental if this is something that you use as a speech language pathologist or a teacher. And there are a lot of different interesting approaches to using both languages to tap into kids' full linguistic repertoire. Okay, so another core principle, growth is a key predictor of success. So this one is something that again we know, but I want to push a little bit into this. I want to dig a little bit deeper to see if we can kind of figure out what does this mean and how can we use this. So we understand fundamentally that when I show somebody something, I try to teach somebody something. I'm working with a child and I'm teaching them a new concept, and I see how quickly they learn. I like that. That tells me that they are, oh wow, what a quick learner. I'm a quick study. Wow, they are really sharp. They picked up on that thing very quickly. So we use these terms a lot, colloquially, but we also know that they're indicative of somebody's potential. So when we see that somebody has potential, they have a steep growth trajectory, they're learning very quickly, we consider that to be a good thing. Um, and what this actually means is we are measuring things at multiple time points. So frequently we're measuring, before and after an intervention of some kind, an instructional period. So where this actually ends up getting borne out is in things like response to intervention and dynamic assessment, which are two conceptually related concepts, but different approaches to doing things. So response to intervention, being a framework for providing intervention, a tiered framework in which we provide instruction, monitor progress, and then provide progressively increasing levels of support in response to after we determine how kids respond to that intervention. Dynamic assessment is a similar concept, but intended more for evaluation purposes when we provide a child with something. So we give a teaching opportunity, then we provide a stimulus through a mediated learning experience, be it some instruction, and then we test again, the test, teach, retest approach. And you might think, oh, that sounds very different. That sounds like you're doing this in a very short amount of time, and that's true. But dynamic assessment can be over sessions. But ultimately, what we're doing is using multiple time points is some type of intervention and then measurement of growth over these time points, so we can see what progress looks like. So when we have things like RTI, response intervention, or MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, these are approaches in which what we're trying to do is see how children grow in response to some type of intervention over time. What does that trajectory look like? These are really, really interesting approaches. As I mentioned before, there's not one approach that's going to fix the issues that we see with academic disparities and disproportionality in special education. And these frameworks kind of fall into that category. We know that they're beneficial, and we know that they're very good, they're evidence-based, but the effect on disproportionality, it remains to be seen. We have some limited evidence of an effect there, but we do know that conceptually, fundamentally, when these are well implemented, we can get some meaningful gains in academic skills. So where does that leave us? So, we have these fundamental concepts that we understand about what it means to work with bilingual kids. Um, but it's almost, it's difficult to kind of come up with a unified approach that will give us everything that we need. And there have been a lot of attempts to try to address the challenges that we see, both academic disparities and disproportionality. Um, the approaches that we have frequently seen in the field of speech language pathology have frequently focused on the quality of assessment, but there have been numerous attempts to kind of hone in on support in early childhood to try to improve identification rates there through improving assessment timing and screening timing. And what we're left with is this notion that, well, we have all these individual things that we know, and this is kind of where I'm leaving things, these core principles, and I went through a few of them. There are other things that we know about working with bilingual kids, but how do we put all these things together in a way that is meaningful? We know that when we do things the right way, when we adhere to best practices, we can make meaningful gains. But, we're still, if we have these things figured out, why do we still have the problems that we have? Why do we still see the challenges that we see? Uh, and, obviously, what that means is more work remains to be done. There are still more things that we can do. So, the question becomes, where do we go from here? And it's not something that I have a concrete answer to. I think there are lots of opportunities and interesting things that we need to consider. Um, the response that I would give to this question of where do we go from here is anywhere that doesn't lead us to the conclusion that there's going to be one solution to the problem. Obviously, the issues that we see with special education disproportionality and academic disparities are multifactorial. And anything is good if it makes a meaningful dent in these issues. But we have to acknowledge that if we tweak one thing, we make one adjustment, that's probably not going to be the thing that will fix everything. So we need to really consider how, when we are changing one thing, how we can fit that into the larger approaches that we take and kind of more globally where things remain. So that is all I have for today. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Round of applause.
If we
Guys,
have any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
any questions?
You might have shared this at the beginning. Sorry. Is there any way, are you going to provide access to the slides?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I don't know, Dr. Overton, if you were planning on distributing, but I'm happy to, I can email them to you if we don't have an official mechanism to get there.
Can I share the email address with Dr. Ortiz that you shared with us to register for today?
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
Sorry, I'm like offline because I'm eating lunch and also
that's
trying to manage
okay.
the school system. But I was like not school system, but school that I'm at.
Yeah,
I was screenshotting like some of the slides and then sending them directly to my some of my members of my special education team. So I was like, it would just be better if I had the whole thing.
yeah,
But thank you so much. This was great, and it was very, I think to somewhat some extent, I think it would have been great to like have the county level see this too, because we're limited in some aspects of like structures, right?
yeah.
So I appreciate you, but I'm going to jump off just because last day before spring break, a little
Yes.
chaotic over here. Thank you both, and have a great day.
All
Thank
right.
you
Thank
as
you for
well.
coming.
Bye-bye.